The West was a land of promises written in dust and deals sealed with blood. It wasn't the gunfights that defined you, but the choices made when the smoke cleared. In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a fire meant to erase a people from the map left behind a single living ember, a small child hidden in the ruins of his home. And the woman who found him, an outcast living on the edge of society, was about to discover that an act of mercy could ignite a war or forge a legend. This is the story of a debt that could not be paid in gold and a thank you that sounded like a declaration of war. The fire was a rumor before it was a sight. It came on the wind, a bitter tang of burnt pine and something else, something greasy and wretched that curled the stomach. Elara Vance smelled it from the porch of her small, isolated cabin, a place tucked so far into the stony folds of the Dragoon Mountains that Redemption Creek was a distant, unpleasant memory. She paused, her hand hovering over a bundle of dried feverfew. Her dog, a scruffy brindle mix named Gus, lifted his head from his paws, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Easy, boy," Elara murmured, though her own heart had quickened. For 2 days, the wind had carried the ugly sounds of men drunk on whiskey and power. Shouts and gunshots echoing from the valley floor where Silas Blackwood's cattle empire sprawled like a blight. Blackwood. The name left a taste like rust in her mouth. He was the uncrowned king of the territory, a man who believed Providence had granted him every acre he could see, and he was actively working to expand his vision. Now this smell. She stepped off the porch, her worn leather boots sinking slightly into the red dirt. To the east, beyond the granite spires that clawed at the sky, a column of smoke bled into the pristine azure. It wasn't the clean white smoke of a campfire, or even the grey plume of a brush fire. This was a thick, oily black, a funeral pyre staining the heavens. It was coming from the direction of the Forbidden Lands, the place the townsfolk spoke of, in hushed, fearful tones, the place where the Amazulu lived. They weren't native to this land, not like the Apache. They were a ghost tribe, a splinter group that had journeyed thousands of miles over decades, a legend whispered by traders and trappers. It was said their ancestors had been brought over on slave ships to the southern coasts, escaped and fled, generation after generation, ever westward, seeking a place that resembled their African homeland. They had found it, in this hidden valley, a pocket of savanna-like grassland and protective cliffs that the Apache left alone and the white man had until recently deemed worthless. But Silas Blackwood saw worth in everything he could fence. Elara's late husband, Thomas, had been different. He was a geologist, a man of quiet observation, and he had seen beauty, not value. He'd met the Zulu, traded with them, and spoke of their leader, a man named Khwezi, with a respect that bordered on reverence. "They are a proud people, Elara," he'd told her, his eyes full of a light she missed every day. "They are lions in a world of wolves." Thomas had died 2 years ago, a rock slide taking him in the very mountains he loved, leaving Elara a pariah. A woman alone was an invitation for trouble, and a woman who preferred her own company and knew more about herbs than scripture was a suspected witch. The smoke thickened. The smell was stronger now, and with it came a profound silence. The gunshots had stopped. The drunken shouts were gone. It was the silence of a deed done, a silence that felt heavier and more terrible than any noise. "Stay here, Gus," she commanded, her voice tight. She went back inside, not for a weapon, but for her medicine bag. She filled a canteen with water, grabbed a small pouch of jerky, and strapped the leather satchel over her shoulder. Thomas would have gone. He would not have hesitated. And in the hollow space, his absence had carved in her chest. His courage was the only thing she had left to cling to. The journey was treacherous. She moved with a practiced ease, her body lean and strong, from years of navigating the harsh terrain to find her herbs. She didn't take the main trail, but followed the high ridges, staying hidden amongst the pinon pines and alligator junipers. From her vantage point, she could see the Blackwood Ranch, far below, tiny figures of men moving about, some unsaddling horses, others disappearing into the long, low bunkhouse. They were done with their work. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the precipice overlooking the Zulu kraal. The sight stole the air from her lungs. It was gone. The small village of beehive-shaped huts, which Thomas had described as a place of vibrant life, of children's laughter, and the rhythm of drums, was a smoldering ruin. Blackened circles on the earth were all that remained of the homes. The central cattle pen, the Izabaya, was a hellscape of charred timbers and the grotesque twisted shapes of dead animals. The smoke wasn't just smoke, it was the ghost of a community. Her stomach churned, and she had to brace herself against a rock, fighting back the bile that rose in her throat. This was not a raid. This was an extermination. The sheer, calculated brutality of it was staggering. Blackwood hadn't just pushed them out. He had tried to erase them from the earth. She waited, listening. The only sound was the crackle of dying embers and the mournful cry of the wind whistling through the desolation. No cries for help, no weeping, nothing. They were all gone, dead or scattered to the winds. A wave of despair washed over her. She was too late. There was nothing to be done. She should turn back, erase the image from her mind, and retreat to the safety of her solitude. But her feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to move, taking her down the steep, rocky path into the valley of death. Walking through the ruins was a nightmare. The air was thick and hot, shimmering with heat. The stench was overwhelming. She forced herself to look, to bear witness. She saw a broken doll, its beaded dress partially melted. She saw the shattered remains of clay pots, their contents spilled and cooked into the dirt. This was not a battlefield. This was a home. She was about to turn away, the horror finally overwhelming her, when she heard it. A cough. It was small, thin, and immediately stifled. Elara froze, every nerve ending, screaming. It couldn't be. She scanned the ruins, her eyes darting from one blackened husk of a hut to another. Nothing. Had she imagined it? Was it the grief in her own heart playing tricks on her ears? Then she saw it. A slight movement beneath a pile of scorched animal hides near the edge of what was once the largest hut, likely the chief's. The hides were stiff and blackened, but something had shifted underneath them. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be a trap, an injured animal, or worse, one of Blackwood's men left behind and waiting. But the cough had sounded so small, so young. Slowly, cautiously, she approached, her hand resting on the handle of the skinning knife at her belt. "Hello," she called out, her voice a dry whisper. There was no response. She reached the pile of hides and used the toe of her boot to nudge the topmost one. It was heavy and stiff. She nudged it again, and it slid away with a rasping sound, revealing a small, dark space beneath. And in that space, curled into a tight ball, was a child. He was a little boy, no older than 4 or 5. He wore only a small leather loincloth, his skin covered in a mixture of soot and tears. His eyes, wide and luminous and utterly terrified, were fixed on her. He was shaking, not from cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen his voice. He had a nasty, shallow gash on his forehead, matted with blood and dirt. For a long moment they just stared at each other. The white woman who lived in the mountains and the Zulu child who had lost everything. He was the sole survivor of a massacre, a living spark in a world of ash. Elara slowly lowered herself to one knee, her movements gentle, deliberate. She held out her empty hands, palms up, a gesture of peace she hoped he would understand. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy flinched as she spoke, pressing himself further into his hiding spot. His gaze darted past her, searching the ruins for his family, for a familiar face, for anything other than this strange woman with pale skin and light-colored eyes. His bottom lip trembled, but he made no sound. The silence was his shield. Elara's heart broke. The clinical detachment of the healer vanished, replaced by a wave of raw protective instinct. This was not a Zulu child or a Blackwood problem. This was a little boy alone and hurt in the wreckage of his world. She reached for her medicine bag, her movements incredibly slow. "I have water," she said softly, unscrewing the cap of her canteen. "And I can clean that cut on your head. Will you let me help you?" He watched her every move, his small body coiled like a spring ready to bolt. She poured a little water onto a clean strip of linen and held it out. He recoiled. She knew she couldn't stay here. Blackwood's men might return to survey their handiwork, or the Apache drawn by the smoke might investigate. This place of death was no place for the living. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it now. To leave him here was to condemn him to a certain death, either from his injury thirst or predators of the two-legged or four-legged variety. To take him with her was to invite the wrath of Silas Blackwood and the entire town of Redemption Creek down upon her head. They would see her act not as one of mercy, but as a theft, an alliance with the savages. She looked into the child's terrified eyes, and in their depths she saw the ghost of her husband's words. "They are lions in a world of wolves." Well, this small, trembling cub was all that was left. And if she was to be damned, she would be damned for an act of compassion. "Come," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she sat back on her heels, making herself smaller, less threatening. She patted the ground beside her. "Come with me. I have a safe place. Food, water. I will keep you safe." She didn't know if he understood her words, but he must have understood the tone. He watched her for a full minute, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, with a hesitation that was agonizing to watch, he began to uncurl himself. He crawled out from under the hides, a small, soot-stained figure, standing shakily amidst the apocalypse of his home. He took one tentative step toward her, then another. When he was finally within arm's reach, he stopped, looking up at her face, his gaze searching for the truth behind her words. Elara simply weighted her heart in her throat. Slowly, deliberately, the little boy reached out and placed his small, grimy hand into her outstretched one. His touch was as light as a feather, a fragile connection in a world shattered by hate. Elara closed her fingers around his, a silent vow passing between them. She would protect this child, no matter the cost. And as she gently led him away from the smoldering ruins, she could feel the eyes of the mountains on her, the ghosts of his people watching. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered now was the small, trembling hand in hers and the long, dangerous road ahead. The journey back to the cabin was a silent, somber affair. The boy, whose name she did not know, walked beside her with a stoicism that was profoundly unnatural for a child his age. He did not cry or complain. He simply endured his small hand remaining firmly in hers, his eyes fixed on the treacherous path ahead. It was as if the horror he had witnessed had burned away all his childhood softness, leaving only a hard, resilient core. Elara named him Thando, in her mind a name from a list Thomas had once shared with her. It meant love, a desperate prayer in a world so full of hate. Once inside her cabin with the heavy wooden door barred and Gus lying watchfully by the hearth, the fragility of the situation settled upon Elara like a shroud. She was harboring a fugitive, though he was the victim of the crime. She had stolen the living evidence of a massacre. Her first priority was the boy. She gently sat him on a stool by the fire and, speaking in low, soothing tones, began to tend to his wound. He flinched when she touched the gash on his forehead, but he did not pull away. His trust was a fragile, unearned gift she was terrified of breaking. As she cleaned the cut, with a solution of boiled water and yarrow, she saw the exhaustion in his small frame. His dark eyes were heavy-lidded, the adrenaline that had kept him going finally ebbing away. "You are safe here," she murmured, dressing the wound with a clean linen bandage. "You can rest now." She offered him a bowl of thin corn gruel, which he ate slowly, mechanically, without any sign of enjoyment. When he was done, she pointed to the small cot in the corner, piled with a soft wool blanket. He looked at the cot, then at her, a question in his eyes. Elara gave him a small, reassuring smile and nodded. "For you." He hesitated for only a moment before climbing onto the cot and curling into a ball, his back to the room. Within minutes, he was asleep, his breathing shallow and even. But it was not a peaceful sleep. His small body twitched, and a single choked sob escaped his lips before he fell silent again. Elara watched him, her heart aching. What nightmares were chasing him through the landscape of his mind? For the next 2 days, a strange, quiet routine formed. Elara spoke to Thando constantly, not expecting a reply, but simply to fill the silence with a gentle sound. She told him about the herbs she was grinding, about Gus's funny habits, about the way the sun hit the canyon walls at dawn. He, in turn, remained silent. He followed her, with his eyes a small shadow in her small world. He learned by watching. He saw where she kept the water bucket, how she stoked the fire, how she spoke to the dog. A silent, intelligent observer, piecing together the rules of this strange new place. The first sign of a breakthrough came on the 3rd morning. Elara was kneading dough for bread, her hands covered in flour. Thando, who was sitting on the floor, carving a piece of soft wood with a blunt stone, suddenly stood up. He walked over to the water bucket, dipped a ladle in, and carried it carefully over to her, holding it up. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was communication. It was an acknowledgement of a shared existence. Tears pricked Elara's eyes. "Thank you, Thando," she said, her voice thick. She made a point to drink from the ladle he offered. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips before vanishing. It was enough, but their fragile peace was not destined to last. Later that afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trail. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider. It was 2 horses moving with purpose. Gus shot to his feet, a volley of fierce barks erupting from his chest. Inside Gus quiet, Elara commanded, her blood turning to ice. She peered through a small crack in the window shutter. Her worst fears were realized. Riding up the path were two men from Blackwood's ranch, Jed and Colby. They were rough men bullies who found sport in the suffering of others. They reined in their horses a few dozen yards from the cabin, their eyes scanning the property with open suspicion. "Howdy, Widow Vance," Jed called out, his voice laced with false bonhomie. "We saw some smoke a few days back. Thought we'd check you ain't been scalped." Elara unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, forcing a calm she did not feel. She stood with her arms crossed, blocking the doorway. "As you can see, I'm quite well. Just a brush fire. I handled it." Colby, a lank-haired man with cruel eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her herb garden. "That's so? We heard different. We heard there was trouble up in the hills. Apache, maybe?" "I've seen no Apache," Elara said, her voice level. "Just the usual coyotes and buzzards." She held their gaze, refusing to be intimidated. It was then that Thando, likely startled by the loud voices, chose to peer around the edge of the door frame. It was only for a second, a flash of a small, dark face and a white bandage, but it was enough. Jed's eyes narrowed, a flicker of dark excitement passing through them. "Well now?" he said slowly, his gaze locking on the doorway. "What kind of coyote is that, Ms. Vance?" Colby grinned, a predatory, humorless expression. "Looks like you found yourself a pet. Blackwood ain't gonna like that. He ain't gonna like that one bit." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. "He's just a boy. He was lost." "He ain't lost no more," Jed sneered. "He's stolen. That's what Blackwood will call it. Stolen property." He shared a look with Colby, a silent, ugly understanding passing between them. With a final lingering glare, they wheeled their horses around and galloped back down the trail. The threat was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was on its way. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She could run. She could pack what little she had, take the boy, and flee deeper into the mountains, into Apache territory where even Blackwood wouldn't dare follow. But they would be hunted. And what life could she offer a child on the run? The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and crimson. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. She sat with her shotgun across her lap, watching the sleeping child, her mind racing. The inevitable arrived the next morning. This time, it was a single rider, but his presence was more menacing than a dozen men, like Jed and Colby. Sheriff Brody sat astride his horse, a big man whose face was a roadmap of compromise and regret. He wore his tin star like a burden. He dismounted slowly and walked to her porch, his gaze troubled. "Elara," he began, his voice low, "you've put me in a terrible position." "I've saved a child's life, Samuel," she corrected him, her voice hard. "The position was made by the men who orphaned him." Brody had the decency to look away, his eyes falling on the tracks left by Jed and Colby's horses. "Silas Blackwood is the law in this valley, you know that. He owns the judge, the council. He owns me. He says the boy is a stray from a hostile tribe, a danger to the community. He wants him. He wants to kill him," Elara stated flatly. "He wants to silence the only witness to his butchery." "I'm not saying it's right." Brody sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "I'm saying it is. Blackwood's rounding up a posse. He plans to come up here himself. He's not going to ask nicely, Elara. He's going to take the boy. And if you're in the way, he'll go right through you." This was the warning, the last chance. The sheriff was in his own weak way trying to help her. "What do you want me to do?" Samuel hand over a child to his parents' murderers. "I want you to live," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Give me the boy. I'll see he gets to the fort at Huachuca. They have scouts there. They can find his people if any are left." Elara looked at him, searching his face for the strength to believe him. But she saw only a man trapped by his own cowardice, a man who would fold the moment Silas Blackwood raised his voice. He might have the best of intentions, but they would pave a road straight to the boy's grave. And then she saw the boy in question, standing in the doorway behind her. Thando had the wooden bird he'd been carving in his hand. He looked at Sheriff Brody, then at Elara. He took a step forward, and with a defiant sort of loyalty that shattered Elara's heart, stood beside her, slipping his small hand into hers. The decision was made, not by her, but for her. "No," Elara said, her voice ringing with a newfound finality. She squeezed the small hand in hers. "The boy stays with me. You can tell Mr. Blackwood that if he wants him, he'll have to come and take him. But I suggest he bring a coffin." Sheriff Brody stared at the two of them, the defiant widow and the silent Zulu child, a united front against the world. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding set of her jaw. He saw the boy's fierce protective stance. He was a good man who had made too many small compromises, and now he stood before a woman who refused to make a single one. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound sadness on his face. "God help you, Elara," he said, turning and walking back to his horse. "Because no one else in this valley will." As his hoofbeats faded into the distance, Elara led Thando back inside and barred the door. The gathering storm had a name, and it was Silas Blackwood. The siege was no longer metaphorical. It had begun. She looked at the shotgun leaning against the wall, then at the small, trusting face of the boy beside her. She had no army, no allies, no hope of rescue. All she had was a promise to a child and a cabin on a lonely mountain. And for now, that would have to be enough. The day after Sheriff Brody's visit passed in a state of suspended dread. Elara did not stray more than a few feet from her cabin. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant hawk sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She had loaded the shotgun and a small pistol Thomas had owned, placing them within easy reach. It was a pitiful defense against a man like Blackwood and his hired guns, but it was the only one she had. Thando seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The near smile she had seen was gone, replaced by the same watchful intensity he'd had when she first found him. He stayed close, a silent shadow at her heels. He saw her check the loads in the shotgun, saw the way her gaze constantly swept the trail below. He did not ask questions, but his eyes were full of them. In a remarkable display of empathy, he seemed to understand that she was now his protector and that she herself was in danger. He would periodically come and pat her hand, a small, reassuring gesture that both fortified and broke her heart. The bond between them deepened in the crucible of their shared isolation. They were no longer a woman and a boy, but a clan of two besieged by the world. That night, as a storm gathered over the peaks, he had a nightmare. He cried out, not a choked sob this time, but a full-throated cry of terror, his hands flailing as if warding off blows. Elara rushed to his cot, gathering him into her arms. "Shh, you're safe now," she crooned, rocking him gently. He clung to her, his small body trembling violently, and for the first time since she found him, he spoke. It was a single word, whispered into the fabric of her shirt, a word she did not understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. Baba. It was a cry of pure anguish, of loss, so profound It had finally broken through his wall of silence. He was calling for his father. He repeated the word over and over, his voice raw with grief. Elara held him tighter, whispering nonsense words of comfort, her own tears falling freely into his hair. There was nothing she could say, nothing she could do to mend the wound in his soul. All she could offer was the warmth of her arms and a promise to stand between him and the darkness. The expected attack did not come the next day, nor the day after. The silence from Redemption Creek was more unnerving than an open threat. Elara knew Blackwood. He was not a man to forgive a slight or forget a challenge. He was a sadist who enjoyed the slow-burning fear of his victims. He was letting her wait. He was letting her terror ripen. Then, on the third morning, a new sound reached the cabin. It was not the sound of hoofbeats. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the soles of her boots. Thump, 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 thump. Gus, who had been dozing by the door, shot to his feet, a low whine in his throat. He wasn't barking. He was listening. Elara grabbed her shotgun and rushed to the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through the crack, her eyes scanning the valley. Nothing. The sound was everywhere, and nowhere at once. It was Thando who identified it. He was standing stock still in the middle of the room, his head cocked, a look of intense concentration on his face. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. It was something else, recognition, and a dawning, incredulous hope. He looked at Elara, then pointed to the east towards the high peaks that separated them from the deeper wilderness, the direction of his ruined home. Ingomati, he whispered, his voice full of awe. The word was foreign, but the meaning was universal. Drums. The sound grew steadily louder, more defined. It was the sound of multiple drums, weaving a complex, powerful rhythm that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound of purpose, of movement, of inexorable advance. It was the sound of warriors. Elara felt a new kind of fear, entirely different from the fear of Blackwood. This was a primal, ancient dread. Had some of the boy's people survived? Were they coming for him? Or were they coming for revenge? And would they see her, a white woman, as just another part of the world that had destroyed them? She was caught, trapped between two advancing forces, both of which had reason to want her dead. She had to see. Leaving Thando inside with Gus, she scrambled up the rocky outcrop behind her cabin, a small vantage point that gave her a clear view of the eastern pass. The drumming was loud now, a palpable force that seemed to shake the very air. And then she saw them. They emerged from the pass, not as a scattered, defeated remnant, but as a disciplined, formidable force. There were at least 30 of them moving in a loose but coordinated formation. They were tall, powerfully built men, their dark skin gleaming with sweat and oil in the morning sun. They carried tall, oval-shaped shields made of cowhide, isilangu, Thomas had called them, and the short, broad-bladed stabbing spear, the deadly iklawa. Their heads were adorned with feathers, and their legs and arms with bands of animal fur. They moved with a fluid, loping grace, covering the ground with an astonishing speed. They were an army, and at their head, walking with a long, powerful stride, was a man who commanded attention even from this distance. He was taller than the rest, with a bearing of absolute authority. He wore a leopard skin over his shoulders, a symbol of royalty. He carried no shield, only a single, long-shafted spear, Even from half a mile away, Elara could feel the intensity of his presence. This had to be their leader. This had to be Khwezi. This had to be Thando's father. They were not heading for Redemption Creek. They were making a direct line for her cabin. Panic seized her. She scrambled back down to the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of terror. They would see her as the kidnapper, the desecrator. They would take the boy and kill her without a second thought. She burst through the door, her face pale. "Thando, hide," she urged, pointing to the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. "Quickly, they're coming," but Thando was not looking at her. He was standing at the door which he had unbarred, staring out at the approaching warriors. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. He began to tremble, and a name burst from his lips, a full-throated, joyous shout. "Abba!" He shot out of the door before Elara could stop him. A small, sprinting figure running toward the formidable army. "Thando, no!" Elara screamed, dropping her shotgun and chasing after him. The warriors, who were now only a few hundred yards away, saw the small boy running towards them. The drumming faltered for a beat, then stopped altogether. The sudden silence was deafening. The leader, the man in the leopard skin, broke from the front of the column. He ran not with the loping grace of a warrior, but with the desperate lunging sprint of a father. "Thando!" His voice boomed across the landscape, a sound of thunder and relief. They met in the open space between the cabin and the woods. Khwezi swept his son up into his arms, burying his face in the boy's small shoulder. The great, powerful chieftain, who had walked at the head of an army, held his son and shook with silent, racking sobs. The warriors stood, motionless, a silent, respectful audience to the sacred reunion of a father and his lost son. Elara skidded to a halt, her heart in her throat, watching the scene unfold. She was an intruder, a spectator to a moment of profound and private joy. She began to back away slowly, intending to retreat to her cabin and disappear. But as Khwezi finally lowered his son to the ground, his eyes lifted and met hers. They were dark, piercing eyes, filled with an intelligence and an emotion she could not immediately decipher. He held her gaze for a long moment, then spoke a few quiet words in his language to his son. Thando, his face radiant, took his father's hand, and then, to Elara's utter astonishment, took her hand as well, pulling the two of them together. The arrival of the warriors had not gone unnoticed in Redemption Creek. From the saloon, from the general store, from the cattle pens, men had seen the terrifying column emerge from the mountains. They had seen them stop before the widow Vance's cabin. The town, which had been simmering with anticipation for Blackwood's brand of justice, now exploded in a panic of a different kind. "It's a war party," a man shouted from the street. "They're teaming up with the witch," another cried. Silas Blackwood stood on the porch of his ranch house, a spyglass to his eye. He had seen it all, the arrival of the warriors, the boy running out, the reunion. But he did not see it as a reunion. He saw it as a rendezvous. He saw the witch who had stolen the boy, now delivering him to a savage army as a prelude to an attack on the town. His face already hard set into a mask of granite. "Saddle up," he snarled to the men gathering around him. "Every man with a rifle. Jed Colby, you take 5 men and get up on that western ridge. Cut off their escape. The rest of you are with me." Sheriff Brody ran towards him, his face pale with alarm. "Silas, wait. We don't know what this is. We can't just open fire." Blackwood turned his cold, dead eyes on the sheriff. "I'll tell you what this is, Brody. It's an insurrection, and we're going to put it down before it starts. They've gathered at the witch's cabin. That makes her cabin the nest, and we are going to burn it to the ground." He swung himself onto his horse, his brand-new Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Today, we finish the job. Up on the mountain, Elara stood, frozen, her hand held gently in the small, insistent grip of the boy who now stood proudly beside his father. The 30 Zulu warriors stood silently behind their chief, their faces unreadable, their spears held at their sides. They were not looking at her with malice. They were simply watching, waiting for their leader's cue. Khwezi's piercing gaze remained on her. The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions and the looming threat of the town below. The joyful reunion was over. A new, far more dangerous chapter was about to begin. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elara stood in the charged space between her humble cabin and the silent, imposing line of Zulu warriors. Her hand was still loosely held by Thando, a living bridge between his father and herself. Khwezi's eyes, dark and intelligent, were still locked on hers. They were not the eyes of a savage, but of a king who had lost his kingdom and found his heir. They held grief, gratitude, and a piercing intelligence that seemed to see right through her. He finally spoke, his voice a low baritone that commanded the air around it. The words were in his native tongue, directed at her. It was not a question, but a statement of acknowledgement. Elara could only shake her head helplessly. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice feeling small and inadequate. A flicker of something surprised disappointment crossed Khwezi's face. He looked down at his son, who then looked up at Elara and pointed to the bandage on his own forehead. He then patted her arm and said a single word in his language, his tone bright and clear. It was a story in 2 gestures and 1 word. "She helped me." Khwezi's expression softened. The hard lines of the warrior king receded, replaced by the weary gratitude of a father. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of respect. He had his answer. But this fragile moment of understanding was shattered by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from below. The posse from Redemption Creek was not moving with the discipline of the Zulu, but with the chaotic, aggressive energy of a mob. They stormed up the trail, a disorderly cluster of about 20 men, their faces a mixture of fear and belligerent bravado. Silas Blackwood was at their head, his horse a powerful black stallion that seemed an extension of his own dark will. Sheriff Brody rode beside him, his face pale and grim, his presence offering no comfort, only the official sanction of the violence to come. The Zulu warriors reacted instantly and with terrifying unity. As one, they moved not forward, but spreading out into a defensive crescent formation. The cowhide shields, the isilangu, swung from their backs to their left arms. The short, deadly Iklawa spears were held ready in their right hands. They did not shout or jeer. Their silence was their most potent weapon. It was the silence of absolute discipline, of men who knew war as an art and not just a brawl. "Hold your positions," Blackwood bellowed, his voice raw with authority. His men, many of whom were simple farmhands or ranch hands, swept up in the hysteria, fumbled with their rifles, their eyes wide at the sight of the organized Zulu line. They reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, forming a ragged, nervous line of their own. 2 worlds faced each other across a clearing of red dirt. On one side, the frantic, loud energy of the settlers with their long-range rifles and their simmering racial animosity. On the other, the silent, coiled power of the Zulu, with their shields and their short spears, an ancient force of war. And in the middle stood Elara Vance. "Brody, get the woman," Blackwood commanded, not taking his eyes off Khwezi. And the boy, Get them out of the way. Sheriff Brody urged his horse forward, his hand held up in a placating gesture. Elara, for God's sake, get back to your cabin. Let me handle this. Handle what, Samuel? She called back, her voice shaking but clear. This isn't a negotiation. It's a firing squad. In the making. That's her, Jed shouted from the settler line, pointing a finger. She's the one. She's been hiding him. She's in league with them. The sentiment rippled through the posse. The fear on their faces began to curdle into anger. Elara was the focal point, the easy, familiar target for their terror. The witch, the traitor. Khwezi saw the shift. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elara and his son. It was a clear, unambiguous gesture of protection. This woman was under his care. Blackwood saw the gesture and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. See, they stand together, the savages and the witch who serves them. This is their land. They think they can just come here and take what they want. The hypocrisy of his words was so immense, it was almost dizzying. Elara stared at him, at this man who had burned and butchered an entire village, now painting himself as the victim of an invasion. He was not just a murderer, he was a master of twisting reality to suit his own narrative. This is a misunderstanding. Elara shouted, her voice desperate. He's the boy's father. He just came for his son. He came with a war party, Colby yelled back. You think we're fools? The tension stretched to a breaking point. A nervous ranch hand fumbled with his rifle, and it discharged into the air with a deafening crack. The sound broke the spell. The Zulu warriors stomped their right feet onto the ground in a single explosive motion. Thump! The sound was like a cannon shot. They slammed the butts of their spears against their shields. Bam, bam, bam. It was a rhythmic, terrifying war cry without a single voice being raised. It was the sound of the machine of war revving its engine. The posse's horses shied and whinnied, their riders struggling to control them. The men's faces went white. This was not the disorganized rabble they had slaughtered at the kraal. This was something else entirely. Steady, Blackwood roared, his face livid with rage. He raised his Winchester, sighting it directly on Khwezi's chest. First man who moves dies. Sheriff Brody looked from Blackwood's unyielding face to the silent, waiting Zulu to the terrified woman in the middle. He knew this was the final moment. Once blood was spilled, there would be no going back. The entire valley would be plunged into a war that would kill hundreds. He spurred his horse forward again, this time riding directly into the line of fire between Blackwood and Khwezi. Silas, no, Brody yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. You fire that shot, and none of us are leaving this mountain alive. Look at them. This isn't a rabble. For once in your goddamn life, stop and think. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in Blackwood's eyes. Not of morality, but of pragmatism. He had 20 scared men with rifles. Before him stood 30 disciplined warriors who seemed to feel no fear at all. His men might get off a first volley, but at this range, the Zulu would close the distance in seconds. It would be a slaughter. His slaughter. He slowly lowered his rifle, but his face was a mask of pure hatred. The opportunity was slipping away. It was in that moment of fragile, temporary peace that Elara knew she had to act. Hiding was no longer an option. Staying silent was a death sentence. She was the only one who could bridge the chasm of silence and misunderstanding. She gently squeezed Thando's hand and then let it go. She looked at Khwezi, at his proud, unbending form, and then at Sheriff Brody, whose face was slick with the sweat of fear and exertion. She took a deep breath, praying for a strength she did not feel. The lives of everyone on this mountain, the warriors, the settlers, the child rested on what she did next. And she knew there was only one path forward. She had to walk into the middle of the fire. With her head held high, she took a step away from the protection of the Zulu chief and began to walk alone and unarmed into the no-man's land between the two armies. Every footstep was a lifetime. Elara walked into the charged space between the two armed groups, feeling the weight of every man's gaze. Behind her stood the silent Zulu warriors. Before her, the angry posse. She was the only moving thing in a tableau of imminent violence. She stopped in the center of the clearing and raised her empty hands. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice clear and strong. "There is no need for this. There is no war party. Save your lies, witch," Jed snarled. "Am I lying?" Elara challenged, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the settlers. "Or do you see what he tells you to see?" She gestured toward Blackwood. "This man," she said, pointing to Khwezi, "is a father. He came for his son. The child you think I stole, I found hiding in the ashes of his home, the only survivor of a brutal massacre." The word massacre hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Several men in the posse shifted uncomfortably. "She's trying to trick you," Blackwood roared. "Am I?" Elara's voice rose, cutting through his tirade. "If they came for war, why have they not attacked? Why would their leader let his son run into the open? Why would he stand in the front unprotected?" Her logic was undeniable. The warrior's behavior was defensive, not aggressive. Seeing the tide turn, Khwezi spoke a quiet command. In a movement of breathtaking precision, every Zulu warrior lowered his spear, planting its butt in the dirt. It was an act of supreme confidence and discipline, a clear gesture of de-escalation. The visual impact on the posse was immense. The terrifying war machine had stood down. Blackwood saw he was losing control. "This changes nothing," he roared, raising his rifle again. "They are on my land. They are a threat." But the men were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Khwezi, who now walked forward slowly unarmed, with his son holding his hand. He stopped beside Elara, and then he spoke. Not in his native Zulu, but in perfect, clear English. "My name is Khwezi, son of Cetshwayo, of the House of Shaka," he said, his piercing gaze locking onto Silas Blackwood. "And you, sir, are trespassing on land granted to my people by treaty. A treaty you violated when you came in the night and murdered our women and children as they slept." The shock was absolute. The perfect English, the regal tone, the calm accusation, it shattered every stereotype. Blackwood was stunned into silence. His entire narrative vaporized. "I did not come here for war," Khwezi continued, his voice calm but laced with iron. "Though I would be justified in wiping your memory from these mountains, I came for my son Thando, whom I believed to be dead." His gaze shifted to Elara, softening with profound gratitude. "I came for my son, and I found him in the care of this woman, Thando Olukulu, a woman of great heart. While your men brought fire and death, she brought water and healing." He then looked directly at Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff, you wear a star meant to represent the law. The law has been broken. The criminal is the man who stands beside you." Brody looked at Blackwood and saw not a powerful cattle baron, but a common murderer. He saw the faces of the posse now staring at Blackwood with dawning horror. They were not soldiers. They were accomplices. The power had shifted not with a bullet, but with the truth. cornered and exposed, Blackwood finally snapped. "He's lying," he screamed, swinging his rifle not towards Khwezi, but towards the source of his humiliation, Elara. He never fired the shot. In the same instant, Sheriff Brody slammed his horse into Blackwood, knocking the rifle askew as it fired harmlessly. Simultaneously, a Zulu throwing spear flew through the air, shattering the rifle's wooden stock with a loud thwack. Blackwood cried out, dropping the ruined weapon. Silence descended once more, the silence of a verdict delivered. He was disarmed, his lies exposed. Sheriff Brody sat on his horse between Blackwood and the world, his choice finally made. The standoff was over. The truth had been a more powerful weapon than any gun. The spell of violence was broken. Silas Blackwood, disarmed and exposed, stared at the spear, quivering in his shattered rifle. His power was gone. The men of Redemption Creek backed away from him, their faces a mixture of shame and fury. "Silas Blackwood," Sheriff Brody said, his voice heavy with a newfound authority. "You are under arrest for murder." Blackwood stared dumbfounded. "You can't arrest me," he stammered. "I am the law." "Not anymore," Brody stated flatly, gesturing with his pistol. "You two as well. Accessories." Jed and Colby, stripped of their power wisely, threw their rifles to the ground. Khwezi watched with detached dignity, taking no joy in the victory. He turned his back on the disgraced cattle baron and faced Elara, the warmth of gratitude returning to his eyes. "The business of your law is concluded," he said, his voice resonant. "Now the business of my heart must be attended to." He issued a series of commands, and his warriors moved with fluid precision, forming two long lines to create a central aisle. The aisle began at Elara's feet and ended with Khwezi, who stood waiting with his son. An older warrior gestured for Elara to walk. Her heart pounded as she began the walk of honor. As she passed between the warriors, a low hum rose from their chests, growing in volume and pitch. They began to stomp their right feet in unison, a powerful, hypnotic beat. Then came the chant, not a war cry, but a praise song, a hlabalela. Their voices rose and fell in complex, beautiful harmony. They chanted of her courage, calling her Inkosazana Yesibindi, the Princess of Courage, and Umthakazisi Wezingane, the bringer of joy to a child. They beat their chests and slammed spears against shields in a percussive, explosive salute that left the posse frozen in awe. When Elara reached Khwezi, the ceremony stopped, plunging the clearing into silence. "In my culture," Khwezi said, his voice ringing in the quiet, "a debt of life can only be honored. You saved the future of my house. You saved my son. Gold is worthless for such a thing." He knelt and withdrew a necklace. It was a simple leather cord holding a single, large, carved lion's tooth, yellowed with age. "This was worn by my grandfather and his father before him," Khwezi said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a symbol of the highest courage and the fiercest protection. Wear it, and my people will know you are a sister to the Zulu. To harm you is to declare war on our nation. You will never be alone again." He stood and placed the necklace around her neck. It felt more real and valuable than any gold coin, a promise, a shield, an alliance. Thando then stepped forward, holding the small wooden bird he had carved. He held it up to her, his eyes shining. It was his only possession, his only gift. Tears streamed down Elara's face as she accepted it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Giabonga." A brilliant smile lit Khwezi's face. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head a gesture his warriors mirrored. The business was done. He swung Thando onto his shoulders, and with a final look at Elara, said, "Live well, Elara Vance." Then he turned and led his people away. Elara stood, watching them go, the lion's tooth heavy on her chest, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. The men of Redemption Creek watched with a new, grudging respect. The power in the valley had settled into a new balance, built not on fear, but on the courage of a lone woman and the gratitude of a king. Elara Vance was no longer an outcast. She was the guardian of a lion's tooth, a bridge between two worlds, and her cabin on the mountain was now an embassy of peace. Narrator Elara Vance's story reminds us that true strength is found not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to protect. It shows how a single act of compassion can unravel an empire of fear and build a bridge of understanding. The American West was forged by countless such quiet heroes whose legacies are etched into the heart of the land. They prove that the most powerful force in the world isn't always a rifle or a lawman's star, but a debt of gratitude and a promise between two very different worlds. If this story of bravery and the powerful bonds that form in unlikely circumstances moved you, please honor its spirit by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend, and be sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the untamed heart of the past. Thank you for watching.